Close your eyes and breathe in deeply. Can you smell it? Fresh bread baking, pastries cooling, the warm scent of cinnamon and vanilla. Tonight, we're embarking on a journey through one of humanity's oldest and most comforting crafts, the art of baking. From the first grains ground between stones to the elaborate confections of today, let the story of flour, fire, and human ingenuity carry you into peaceful sleep. Our story begins over 10,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent, that arc of land stretching from modern-day Egypt through the Middle East to the Persian Gulf. This is where humans first transitioned from nomadic hunter-gatherers to settled farmers, and it all started with wild grasses. The ancestors of wheat, barley, and other grains grew wild across these ancient hills and valleys, their seeds nutritious but difficult to harvest and process. Early humans noticed these grasses, collected their seeds, and began the slow process of cultivation that would change civilization forever. Around 8000 BCE, people in the Fertile Crescent began deliberately planting seeds from the largest, most productive grain plants, unknowingly beginning the domestication of wheat and barley. This agricultural revolution allowed communities to settle in one place, store surplus food, and support larger populations. The first farmers discovered that grain seeds needed to be separated from their tough outer husks, a laborious process done by hand or by pounding. They used simple grinding stones, a flat stone base and a rounded stone on top, to crush the grain into coarse meal. This meal was mixed with water to create a paste that could be eaten raw, but someone, somewhere, made a discovery that would echo through millennia. When this grain paste was placed on a hot stone near a fire, something magical happened. It transformed into something new, something better. The heat changed the texture and flavor, creating a primitive flatbread, probably more like a cracker than what we'd recognize as bread today. This first baked good was born not from a recipe but from experimentation and accident, perhaps around 12,000 years ago. These early flatbreads were dense, chewy, and probably quite bland, but they were nutritious and could be stored longer than raw grain paste. The ancient Egyptians, around 3000 BCE, made the next great leap in baking. They discovered leavened bread. Wild yeast spores, floating in the air, landed in grain paste that had been left sitting, and the mixture began to ferment and bubble. When baked, this fermented dough rose and became lighter, airier, and more digestible than flatbread. The Egyptians didn't understand the science. They couldn't see the microscopic yeast cells, but they knew that this magical transformation produced superior bread. They learned to save a piece of fermented dough to start the next batch, passing living yeast cultures from one baking to the next, a practice that continues today with sourdough starters. Egyptian bakeries became sophisticated operations, with different types of bread for different social classes. Archaeologists have identified over 50 different types of bread and pastries in ancient Egyptian tombs, left as offerings for the deceased to enjoy in the afterlife. Some breads were shaped like animals or geometric forms, others were sweetened with honey or enriched with milk and eggs. The Egyptians even created the first beer, which was essentially liquid bread, fermented grain mash, considered both food and beverage. Baking was so important to Egyptian culture that bread was used as currency, with workers receiving their wages in loaves. The Egyptians built large communal ovens, usually cylindrical clay structures where loaves were stuck to the hot interior walls, an early version of the tandoor ovens still used today. They also created the first pastries by mixing rendered fat into dough, creating layers, an early precursor to what would eventually become filo and puff pastry. Ancient Greece inherited Egyptian baking knowledge and expanded upon it significantly. Greek bakers created over 70 different types of bread, each with its own name and purpose. They made milk bread softened with milk and butter, barley bread for common people, and fine white bread for the wealthy. The Greeks discovered that different grains produced different flavors and textures, preferring wheat for its superior gluten content that created lighter, airier loaves. They added wine, milk, olive oil, and even cheese to their doughs, creating early versions of enriched breads. Greek bakeries were commercial enterprises, and professional bakers formed guilds, marking the beginning of baking as a specialized trade rather than just a household task. The Greeks also created plakos, flat cakes made with flour, honey, cheese, and olive oil, often flavored with bay leaves, considered the ancestors of modern cheesecake. They made honey cakes for religious festivals, offering them to the gods at temples. Honey was the primary sweetener throughout the ancient world, as sugar was unknown in Europe. The Greeks celebrated bread in their mythology. Demeter, goddess of the harvest, was said to have taught humans how to grow grain and make bread. When Rome conquered Greece, they absorbed Greek baking knowledge and industrialized it. The Romans created the first large-scale commercial bakeries, massive operations with dozens of workers and enormous ovens. They built the first rotary mills, where a donkey or slave would walk in circles turning a large millstone, grinding grain far more efficiently than hand stones. Roman bakers formed powerful guilds called collegia, with strict rules about training, quality standards, and business practices. The Roman government recognized bread's political importance. The phrase bread and circuses referred to the state's strategy of keeping the populace content with free bread distributions and entertainment. At Rome's height, the city contained over 300 bakeries, and bakers were respected craftsmen, often freed slaves who had learned the trade. Roman bread came in many forms. Panis militaris was hard biscuit bread for soldiers, panis plebeius was dark bread for common people, and panis secundarius was refined white bread for the wealthy. The Romans discovered that aging flour improved its baking properties, and they even experimented with adding chemicals to whiten flour artificially. They created libum, sacrificial cakes made with flour, cheese, and honey, used in religious ceremonies. Romans enjoyed placenta, a light pastry made with thin sheets of dough spread with cheese and honey, clearly descended from Greek traditions but more elaborate. For special occasions, wealthy Romans commissioned elaborate baked showpieces, bread sculptures shaped like buildings, animals, or even famous people. The Romans spread baking technology throughout their empire, building bakeries in every major city from Britain to North Africa. When the Roman Empire fell in the 5th century CE, much of this sophisticated baking knowledge was temporarily lost in Western Europe, though it continued in the Byzantine Empire in the East. During the early medieval period in Europe, baking regressed somewhat, with most households returning to simple hearth baking. Monasteries and convents became the preservers of baking knowledge during the Dark Ages. Monks and nuns baked bread daily as part of their religious routine, and monasteries often ran the only professional bakeries in their regions. Monastic bakers experimented with recipes during long hours in prayer and work, creating many of the enriched breads and early pastries we know today. They added eggs, butter, and honey to festival breads, creating predecessors to brioche and panettone. Monks discovered that ale balm, the foamy yeast residue from beer brewing, could be used to leaven bread, creating a more reliable rising agent than wild yeast starters. By the 11th century, commercial baking was reviving in medieval European towns. Guilds of bakers formed, strictly controlling who could bake professionally and setting quality standards. These guilds distinguished between white bakers, who used refined wheat flour and served the wealthy, and brown bakers, who made coarser breads from rye or barley for common people. Medieval laws regulated bread quality and pricing with surprising strictness. Bakers who cheated customers by selling underweight loaves faced public punishment including fines, pillories, or even being dragged through streets with the offending loaf tied around their neck. This led to the baker's dozen. Bakers would include 13 items when asked for 12 to ensure they weren't accused of shortchanging customers. Medieval European bread varied dramatically by region and social class. Peasants ate dark, dense bread made from whatever grain grew locally, rye in northern Europe, barley in upland areas, wheat in more fortunate regions. This bread was often so hard that it was used as a plate, called a trencher, soaking up meat juices and sauces before being eaten or given to the poor. Wealthy nobles ate white wheat bread called manchet, made from finely sifted flour and enriched with milk and eggs. The medieval period saw the development of sourdough rye breads in Germany and Eastern Europe, dense, flavorful loaves that could sustain families through long winters. In Scandinavia, bakers created crisp breads and knackebrod, flat breads that could be stored for months without spoiling. The Crusades, beginning in the 11th century, brought European bakers into contact with Middle Eastern and Byzantine baking traditions. Crusaders returned home with knowledge of new spices, techniques, and pastries. They encountered filo-like pastries in Constantinople, phyllo doughs stretched paper-thin and laid with nuts and honey. They discovered marzipan, a confection made from ground almonds and sugar, which became popular among European nobility. They brought back recipes for spiced honey cakes and learned new ways of using precious spices like cinnamon, cloves, and ginger in baking. Sugar, though still rare and expensive, began appearing in European markets, imported from the Middle East and, later, from sugarcane plantations established in the Mediterranean. The medieval period also saw the development of pretzels, with legends attributing their creation to European monks who shaped dough to resemble arms crossed in prayer and gave them to children as rewards for learning prayers. By the 14th century, specialized pastry bakers called pastelists were emerging as distinct from bread bakers. These artisans created early pies with thick, inedible crusts called coffins, which served as baking containers for meat, fish, or fruit. These crusts were so sturdy they could hold liquid fillings without leaking and were often not eaten but discarded after the filling was consumed. Gradually, these crusts became thinner and more palatable as bakers added more fat to the dough, creating the flaky pie crusts we know today. Medieval cooks created elaborate pies for feasts, including the famous 4-and-20 blackbird's pie, a large pie with a bottom crust, filled with live birds under an upper crust that was removed at the table so the birds would fly out, entertaining guests. Sweet pies filled with fruit and honey appeared at noble tables, though sugar was still too expensive for most people. Tarts, open-topped pastries with sweet or savory fillings, became popular in medieval England and France. The Renaissance, beginning in 14th century Italy, brought a revolution in baking as in all arts. Italian bakers, supported by wealthy merchant families, created increasingly elaborate pastries and breads. Panettone, the famous Italian Christmas bread studded with dried fruit, originated in Milan during this period, with legends attributing its creation to a baker's apprentice named Tony who improvised a rich bread when the Christmas batch was ruined. The Florentines created schiacciata, an early focaccia, and various biscotti, twice-baked cookies that were crisp and perfect for dipping in wine. Catherine de' Medici's marriage to the future King Henry II of France in 1533 brought Italian pastry chefs to the French court, sparking a revolution in French baking. These Italian masters introduced French bakers to new techniques for working with sugar, which was becoming more available as Spanish and Portuguese colonies in the Americas ramped up sugar production. French bakers eagerly adopted and refined these techniques, beginning France's ascent to dominance in pastry arts. The 16th century saw the development of puff pastry, or pâte feuilletée, in France. The technique of folding butter into dough repeatedly to create hundreds of delicate, flaky layers required skill and patience. Legend credits its invention to Claude Gelée, a 17th-century pastry apprentice, though laid pastries existed earlier. Regardless of its origin, French bakers perfected puff pastry, using it to create vol au vents, palmiers, and napoleons. Chouse pastry, the dough used for éclairs and cream puffs, was created in the 16th century, possibly by Catherine de' Medici's chef Popolini, or perfected later by Marie-Antoine Carême in the 19th century. Historians debate its exact origins. This revolutionary dough, which puffs up from steam when baked, opened new possibilities for filled pastries. Meanwhile, in England, the Tudor period saw the creation of elaborate pies and tarts. Mince pies, originally filled with spiced meat as well as fruits, became associated with Christmas celebrations. The English created suet puddings, dense steamed cakes that were boiled in cloth bags. These puddings could be sweet or savory, sustaining families through cold winters. Gingerbread became wildly popular in Elizabethan England, shaped into decorative forms and gilded with gold leaf for special occasions. Queen Elizabeth I allegedly commissioned gingerbread cookies shaped like her guests, an early form of the gingerbread man. Across the Atlantic, European colonists brought their baking traditions to the Americas and adapted them to new ingredients. Native Americans had been baking cornbread and grinding corn for centuries, and colonists learned to use cornmeal when wheat flour was scarce. They discovered maple syrup as a sweetener, tapped from trees each spring. The Dutch settlers in New Amsterdam, later New York, brought their love of sweets, cookies, and fried doughs. They made oliebollen, fried dough balls that were ancestors to modern donuts, though without the hole yet. Here's where one of America's most beloved treats has its origins. The development of the donut hole is actually credited to an American sea captain named Hanson Gregory from Maine. In 1847, Gregory was just a teenager working on a ship when his mother packed him oliebollen for his voyage. The story goes that young Hanson noticed the centers of these fried cakes were often undercooked and greasy while the outside was overdone. One day, whether out of frustration or inspiration, he took the lid off the ship's tin pepper box and punched a hole through the center of the raw dough before frying. The result was a perfectly cooked ring of fried dough, crispy outside and cooked through. Gregory later claimed he put the hole in the donut, and while historians debate whether he was truly first, he certainly popularized it. His innovation solved the age-old problem of achieving even cooking in fried dough, and soon the ring-shaped donut with its distinctive hole became an American icon. Donuts would go on to fuel American soldiers in World War I, served by volunteers called donut dollies, and become an integral part of American culture. But let's return to the broader story of baking's evolution. The 17th century brought the scientific revolution, and with it, a better understanding of baking chemistry, though bakers still didn't fully understand yeast. They knew that ale balm worked, that sourdough starters worked, but they didn't know why. Dutch scientist Antony van Leeuwenhoek observed yeast cells under his microscope in 1680, but their role in fermentation wasn't understood for another 2 centuries. French scientist Louis Pasteur finally explained fermentation in the 1850s, showing that yeast was a living organism consuming sugars and producing carbon dioxide. This understanding allowed bakers to cultivate pure yeast strains reliably. Commercial yeast production began in the late 19th century, revolutionizing home baking. For the first time, anyone could bake risen bread without maintaining a sourdough starter or relying on unpredictable ale balm. The 18th century saw the rise of professional pastry chefs who created increasingly elaborate desserts for royal courts. Marie-Antoine Carême, born in 1784, would become known as the King of Chefs and the Chef of Kings, creating architectural pastry showpieces for Napoleon, Talleyrand, and other nobility. Carême codified French pastry techniques, writing comprehensive cookbooks that organized and explained the 5 mother sauces and established pastry-making as a refined art. He popularized the chef's toque, the tall white hat still worn by chefs today. Carême's influence on pastry cannot be overstated. He created recipes and techniques still taught in culinary schools worldwide. The 18th century also saw the development of the modern wedding cake in England. Early wedding cakes were more like sweetbreads, but as sugar became cheaper and more available, bakers created elaborate tiered cakes covered in white icing, symbolizing purity and prosperity. The tradition of tiered cakes originated from an old British custom where guests would bring small cakes that were stacked as high as possible, and the bride and groom would kiss over the stack. Eventually, a clever baker decided to ice all the small cakes together into one tall structure. The Industrial Revolution of the late 18th and 19th centuries transformed baking from an artisan craft to an industrial process. The invention of the roller mill in 1834 by Swiss engineer Jacob Sulzberger allowed flour to be ground more finely and efficiently than ever before. Roller mills could remove the wheat germ and bran completely, producing pure white flour on an industrial scale. While this flour had less nutritional value, it produced lighter, whiter bread that people preferred. The steam engine allowed mills to operate independent of water or wind power, and mechanization reduced the cost of flour dramatically. For the first time in history, even poor people could afford white bread regularly. The development of chemical leavening agents transformed baking in the 19th century. Pearl ash, refined from wood ash, was used in America as early as the 1790s as a chemical rising agent, giving rise to the term saleratus. In 1846, the introduction of baking soda, or sodium bicarbonate, provided a reliable chemical leavener. Baking powder, which combined baking soda with an acid so it would react without requiring acidic ingredients in the recipe, was invented in the 1850s. These innovations meant that cakes and quick breads could be made without yeast, dramatically simplifying baking. Home bakers could now make tender cakes, fluffy biscuits, and various quick breads with ease. American baking in the 19th century developed its own identity distinct from European traditions. The Boston cream pie, despite its name actually a cake, was created at Boston's Parker House Hotel in 1856. Pound cake, which got its name from the original recipe calling for a pound each of butter, sugar, eggs, and flour, became a staple of American home baking. Devil's food cake, a rich chocolate cake, appeared in the late 1800s as cocoa became more affordable. The brownie was invented, according to legend, at the Palmer House Hotel in Chicago for the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition, though other origin stories exist. American cookies developed their own character. Chocolate chip cookies wouldn't be invented until 1938 by Ruth Wakefield at the Toll House in Massachusetts. She cut up a Nestle chocolate bar and mixed the chunks into cookie dough, expecting them to melt and create chocolate cookies, but instead the chips held their shape, creating an instant classic. Peanut butter cookies became possible after George Washington Carver promoted peanuts as a crop and peanut butter became popular in the early 1900s. Snickerdoodles, sugar cookies rolled in cinnamon sugar, have murky origins but became an American favorite, possibly brought by Dutch or German immigrants. The late 19th century saw the birth of industrial commercial baking. In 1849, English entrepreneur Henry Jones patented a method for mass-producing baked goods, particularly biscuits, on a large scale. The National Biscuit Company, later known as Nabisco, was formed in 1898, consolidating hundreds of small bakeries and introducing packaged crackers and cookies that could be shipped nationwide. The animal cracker, a sweet cookie shaped like circus animals, was introduced by Nabisco in 1902, packaged in the iconic box designed to hang on Christmas trees. Graham crackers, invented earlier in the 1800s by Reverend Sylvester Graham as part of a diet reform movement emphasizing whole wheat flour, became a commercial success. Oreos, one of the world's most popular cookies, were introduced by Nabisco in 1912, their origin possibly inspired by the similar Hydrox cookie introduced by Sunshine Biscuits in 1908. The early 20th century brought further mechanization to bakeries. The electric mixer, developed in the early 1900s, eliminated the need for laborious hand-beating of doughs and batters. Herbert Johnson's KitchenAid stand mixer, introduced to home cooks in 1919, became an icon of American kitchens. Commercial sliced bread was introduced in 1928 by Otto Frederick Roeder, who invented a machine that could slice and wrap bread in one operation. This innovation was so successful that the best thing since sliced bread entered the language as an expression of excellence. Pre-sliced bread made sandwiches easier and more uniform, changing American eating habits. Wonder Bread, introduced in 1921, became synonymous with soft, white industrial bread, though critics argued it sacrificed flavor and nutrition for convenience and shelf life. The two world wars significantly impacted baking. During World War I, home bakers were encouraged to conserve wheat for soldiers, leading to recipes using alternative flours and less sugar. Victory gardens and home baking became patriotic duties. During World War II, rationing of sugar, butter, eggs, and flour forced bakers to become creative. Cakes made with vegetable oil instead of butter, eggless cookies, and wacky cakes made with vinegar and baking soda instead of eggs appeared. Mock recipes tried to imitate treats that were unavailable. Mock apple pie made with crackers instead of apples became surprisingly popular. Carrot cake gained popularity as a way to add moisture and sweetness to cakes when sugar was rationed. After World War II, convenience became the watchword of American baking. Cake mixes, introduced by companies like Betty Crocker and Duncan Hines in the late 1940s, allowed home bakers to make cakes by just adding eggs and water. Early cake mixes actually flopped because they were too easy. Psychologists suggested that home bakers felt guilty using them because they seemed like cheating. When manufacturers reformulated the mixes to require adding fresh eggs, giving bakers a sense of participation, sales soared. Instant pudding mixes, brownie mixes, and cookie dough that could be sliced and baked from a refrigerated tube all followed. The 1950s saw the rise of television cooking shows, with personalities like Julia Child bringing French cooking and baking techniques to American home cooks. Child's mastery of French techniques demystified complex recipes, showing Americans that they could make croissants, soufflés, and elaborate pastries at home. Her influence sparked a renewed interest in baking from scratch and elevated home baking beyond simple cakes and cookies. The 1960s and 70s brought health food movements that questioned refined white flour and excessive sugar. Whole wheat bread experienced a revival, and artisan bakeries began appearing that rejected industrial methods in favor of traditional techniques. The 1970s saw the publication of the Tasajara Bread Book by Edward S. Brown, which introduced many Americans to the meditative, handmade approach of baking from the Buddhist Tasajara monastery. Sourdough bread, particularly associated with San Francisco, became popular nationally as people sought bread with more flavor and character than industrial loaves. French baguettes and Italian ciabatta appeared in American bakeries as consumers developed more sophisticated tastes. The croissant, that flaky, buttery icon of French baking, became an American breakfast staple in the 1980s and 90s. The late 20th century saw a renaissance in artisan baking worldwide. Bakers rejected industrial methods and returned to long fermentation times, natural leavening, and traditional techniques. Books like Nancy Silverton's Breads from the La Brea Bakery and Peter Reinhardt's The Bread Baker's Apprentice taught home bakers professional techniques. The no-knead bread method, popularized by Mark Bittman and Jim Leahy in 2006, revolutionized home bread baking by showing that excellent bread could be made with minimal effort and no kneading, just time. This technique made artisan-style bread accessible to anyone with a Dutch oven. The 21st century has seen an explosion of interest in baking, amplified by the internet and social media. Baking blogs and YouTube channels allow anyone to share recipes and techniques globally. The Great British Bake Off, which premiered in 2010, sparked a worldwide baking craze, inspiring millions to try making their own bread, cakes, and pastries. Instagram transformed baking into visual art, with elaborate decorated cakes, rainbow bagels, and picture-perfect pastries going viral. Molecular gastronomy influenced baking, with chefs using techniques like sous vide, liquid nitrogen, and hydrocolloids to create novel textures and presentations. Cronuts, a croissant donut hybrid created by Dominique Ansel in 2013, caused such a sensation that people waited in line for hours to try them. Ancient techniques have been rediscovered and celebrated, naturally leavened breads made with heritage grain varieties, baked in wood-fired ovens, command premium prices. The pandemic of 2020 caused a global baking boom as people stuck at home turned to baking for comfort and creativity. Flour and yeast sold out in stores as millions of people attempted to make sourdough bread for the first time. Baking became a form of therapy, a way to create something tangible and nourishing during uncertain times. Social media filled with pictures of homemade bread, elaborate cakes, and creative cookies as people shared their creations and supported each other. Today's bakers have access to ingredients and equipment that would astonish bakers from even 50 years ago. We can buy specialty flours milled from specific wheat varieties. We can order vanilla beans from Madagascar and chocolate from Ecuador with a few clicks. Digital thermometers, stand mixers, and precision scales make baking more reliable. Yet the fundamental act remains unchanged: mixing flour, water, and leavening, applying heat, and creating something greater than the sum of its parts. Modern bakers experiment with alternative flours made from nuts, ancient grains like spelt and einkorn, and even vegetables. Gluten-free baking has evolved from producing sad, crumbly substitutes to creating genuinely delicious breads and pastries. Vegan baking has achieved remarkable results, proving that eggs and butter, while wonderful, aren't absolutely necessary for excellent baked goods. The science of baking is now well understood. We know about gluten development, the Maillard reaction that creates browning and flavor, how different leavening agents work. Yet baking retains its mystery and magic. Two bakers can follow the same recipe and produce different results. Slight variations in flour protein content, water temperature, humidity, even the vigor of mixing can change outcomes. This is part of baking's enduring appeal. It requires both precision and intuition, science and art. Throughout history, baking has been far more than just making food. It has been a way to mark celebrations, comfort the sorrowful, welcome guests, and express love. Birthday cakes have celebrated millions of lives, wedding cakes have adorned countless unions, bread has been broken in friendship and communion. Baking has brought families together in kitchens, with children learning at their grandmother's elbow, traditions passed down through generations. The smell of baking bread has welcomed people home, created memories, and connected us to something fundamental about being human. From those first flatbreads on hot stones to today's elaborate creations, baking has evolved alongside civilization. It has reflected our values, our available resources, our creativity and ingenuity. It has been elevated to high art by master pastry chefs and practiced daily by home bakers simply feeding their families. It has adapted to every culture, every climate, every available ingredient, yet retained certain universal truths: that flour and water and heat can create something nourishing and beautiful, that the act of creation is as valuable as the product, that sharing what we bake builds community and connection. And so the story of baking continues, in professional kitchens and home ovens around the world, as people mix, knead, fold, and shape, creating the next chapter in this ancient craft. Rest now, and may your dreams be filled with the scent of fresh bread, the taste of flaky pastry, the warmth of cookies just out of the oven. The story of baking is the story of human creativity, persistence, and the simple joy of making something with your own hands. Sleep peacefully, knowing that tomorrow, somewhere, someone will mix flour and water and continue this tradition that stretches back 10,000 years, connecting us all across time through the simple, profound act of baking.